Welcome everyone to this Fireside run by the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. My name is Abigail McKay. I'm currently the social media and communications intern for MESA. I've been in this position for just over a year and a half and I've loved it. And I recently graduated from Utah State University with a bachelor's in environmental studies, and I'm really stoked to go to grad school next year. We have a couple board members here. We have Mark Coles-Ritchie, who is our board secretary, and we have Soren Simonson, who is our board treasurer in attendance. And if you are interested in joining the MESA board, we currently have spots open, so message us at mesastewardship.org to join us. We've been an organization for about 10 years. 2023 is our 10-year anniversary, so it's a really cool new but starting to grow organization. And the mission of MESA is answering the call to be good stewards of Earth and all creation by building a faith-based movement of environmental stewardship and conservation action. Before we get started, we just have a couple announcements. So MESA does an activity every month. We alternate between online firesides and in-person activities in different locations. Next month, we'll be doing an in-person documentary screening of The Politics of Beauty by John DeGraff. It's a movie about Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of Interior for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. It's a really good movie. I've seen it, and it'll be in Salt Lake City. More details to come. And then June is the 190th anniversary of the revelation known as the Plat of Zion. It used to settle more than 750 Mormon pioneer communities in North America, and still a great case study for walkable communities. We're gonna put more information about that on our newsletter. To join our newsletter, go to mesastewardship.org, where you can see the newsletter, fireside announcement, gathering, and other opportunities to advocate to be good stewards of the earth. And it's my pleasure to introduce one of my professors from last semester, Patrick Mason. Patrick Mason is a professor of religious studies and history at Utah State University, where he holds the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture. He is the author and editor of several books, including most recently Proclaim Peace, the Restoration's Answer to an Age of Conflict, co-authored with David Polisford. He and his wife, Melissa, live in Logan, Utah with their 4 kids, Tortoise, Bearded Dragon, and Goldfish.
All right, thanks, Abby. My turn, I guess. All right. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Glad to be with you all here tonight. This is I admire what MESA stands for and is all about, and I'm happy to be here and offer a few thoughts. Now, in a lot of ways, you're all the experts in the room, certainly compared to me. I don't claim any special expertise in this area, but I've done some research and thinking in this area, and I want to share some of it with you tonight. And what I'll be doing tonight is a little bit more in my bailiwick. I'm a historian of American religion and a historian of Mormonism. So I'm going to share a few historical case studies, but then offer a few reflections that come out of that, and we'll just kind of see where this goes. And again, I'm deferring to many of you who have been in this arena for a very long time and have thought deeply and have been committed to action in the realm of environmental stewardship. So, I don't think it's any mystery or surprise to say that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has never identified care for the environment as a quote unquote moral issue on par with abortion, gambling and alcohol, gay marriage, and religious freedom, all of which are issues that have merited direct church statements and even more significantly, active forms of political involvement over the decades, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, I wouldn't say it's fair to say that Latter-day Saints and the church have been completely silent on environmental issues, but I do think it's probably fair to say that the church, by and large, has remained neutral in conflicts between environmental, conservationist, and business development interests, especially in the American West. And this is all the more striking because it's precisely in the American West, and especially the Intermountain West, where the church is headquartered, that this is both an area of the church's greatest demographic and political strength, of course, but also the region, at least in this country, where many of these battles are most poignant and significant and certainly public. And so what I want to do is sort of think about that that neutrality or lack of political action on behalf of the institutional church, and I want to sort of trace some ideas throughout the church's nearly 200-year history. So I want to kind of outline some of the foundational theology that I think informs all of this to begin with. And then I want to do 4 brief snapshots from throughout church history to illustrate some of the points I want to make, and then I'll close with some broader reflections. And the 4 snapshots, the first will be the pioneer period of Mormon settlement in what we now call Utah. The second will be Apostle John A. Whitsoe. The third will be Apostle and later church president Ezra Taft Benson. And then some reflections about the contemporary period as well. So that's just kind of a roadmap of where we'll be going tonight. So in terms of the foundational theology, and this will be familiar to most, if not all of you on the call tonight, that the Latter-day Saints learned very early on from some of Joseph Smith's revelations. They provided a kind of theological foundation for the way that we think about our relationship to creation and to this earth. So in what we now have as Doctrine and Covenants 49, this was an early 1831 revelation. Smith revealed in the Lord's words that this earth is ordained for the use of man. A few months later, in a revelation we now have as Doctrine and Covenants 59, it sort of continued and expanded on this theme. And it said, the fullness of the earth is yours. The beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and that which climbeth upon trees and walketh upon the earth, yea, and the herb and the good things which cometh of the earth, yea, all things which cometh of the earth are made for the benefit and the use of man, both to please the eye and to gladden the heart. Yea, for food and for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. And it pleaseth God that he has given all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made to be used, with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. So in a lot of ways, I think that passage from this 1831 revelation, I think that's, I would say it's the kind of bedrock revelation, at least for restoration scripture, to think about our relationship to the earth. Now, I think there's a few points that bear mentioning here, both in this revelation and then in the broader Latter-day Saint theology. So clearly, humans have a sacred connection to the earth and to all natural objects, to plants and animals. Later on, the idea would develop that those plants and animals have an innate spirit that are alive within them. But Mormon theology, I think, makes a crucial distinction, that humans are the children of God, while all these other things are the creation of God. Certainly, God cares for all of his creations, but humans have a privileged place, not just as the culmination of God's handiwork, as depicted in Genesis and in the various restoration accounts of creation, but as literal children and heirs of God. So humans are stewards of the earth, but ultimately, as another one of Smith's revelations stated, the earth shall be given unto them for an inheritance. So in this regard, I would suggest the Latter-day Saint theology has always been decidedly anthropocentric, with the earth as a stage for a human morality play. So in Latter-day Saint scripture, God created the earth with the express intent of providing a place for humans to dwell and prove if they would keep God's laws and commandments. Now this anthropocentric theology, some of these statements that we see have led some scholars, some environmental scholars who are not Latter-day Saints, I think they've sometimes mistakenly confused the Mormon emphasis on human moral progress and salvation with a kind of inherent anti-environmentalism. So one scholar, Max Ulschwanger, wrote that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the only denomination that has formally stated its opposition to ecology as part of the church's mission. Other scholars have dismissively cited the church's millennial expectations that Jesus will come again and renew the earth. They've said that this is a kind of formidable and maybe even insurmountable obstacle to the development and application of a meaningful environmental theology and ethic among Latter-day Saints. Now, I actually don't agree with either of those critiques. I don't think they're entirely without merit, but I don't think they paint the full picture. And I'll get back to this at the end of the presentation when I kind of step back and offer a few reflections. But it's important to recognize that at least some people looking from outside the faith, and maybe some people from inside the faith, have looked at this theological foundation in these revelations to Joseph Smith, where the earth is clearly created for the purpose and benefit of human beings, and have seen in that a kind of anti-environmental ethic. So again, I want to sort of complicate that, but I want to do that through a few historical case studies. So first of all, the pioneer generation. So in 1856, Brigham Young remarked, "We've been hunting during the past 26 years since the church's organization in 1830 for a place where we could raise saints, not merely wheat and corn." He said this, of course, from Utah, where they had arrived and settled nearly a decade earlier. And Brigham Young proclaimed Utah to be a first-rate place to a first-rate place to raise saints. All right, so this is how Brigham Young always saw Utah, that this is a place where he would cultivate the raising of saints more than the raising of crops. Now, because in this early period of Utah history, ecclesiastical and political leadership were they were basically one and the same, especially in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. What it meant that was that church leaders were also the leaders of community building and the allocation of land, the stewardship of resources, and so forth. And they did develop a kind of pioneer Mormon conservation ethic. It was always pragmatic at heart. There was a recognition that there were resources here that would support the growing population of Latter-day Saints, that fresh water and timber were available, but not abundant. And so the lack of arable land, especially compared to some of the other places where they had lived and emigrated from, meant that these church leaders, who doubled as civic leaders, had to encourage prudent resource management and conservation. And if you go back to church leaders' talks in the 1850s and 60s, they're talking about land use and fencing and water rights as much as they're talking about what we typically think of as more spiritual concepts. But overall, this message of conservation and a prudent stewardship of the land, it did not necessarily take hold among the rank and file. That many of these pioneers, they had developed their skills with farming and livestock and timber in drastically different climates. And while they were ingenious in adapting these skills to the climate of the Intermountain West, sometimes their use of the land and their care for the land left something to be desired. And so in 1865, less than 2 decades after Mormon pioneers had first come to the Intermountain West, Apostle Orson Hyde said this: "I find the longer we live in these valleys, that the range is becoming more and more destitute of grass. The grass is not only eaten up by the great amount of stock that feed upon it, but they tramp it out by the very roots. And where grass once grew luxuriantly, there's now nothing but the desert weed, and hardly a spear of grass is to be seen." So less than 20 years after the Mormon pioneers arrive, you've got church leaders lamenting the rather actually poor management and poor conservation of the region's existing resources. And this situation only gets worse actually in the rest of the 19th century as church leaders actually lose their political clout because of the conflicts with the federal government in the 1870s and 1880s. And this kind of communitarian vision that Brigham Young had tried to implement essentially gives way to the morality or amorality of the free market. And this is what the historian Thomas Alexander, one of the great historians, especially of this period, actually of any period of Mormon history, but Tom Alexander argued that as the Mormons became more like other Euro-Americans, many Mormons began to interpret economic freedom as a license to savage the physical environment in their quest for wealth. To savage the physical environment in their quest for wealth. And here Alexander was, Tom Alexander was specifically looking at Latter-day Saints in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So he identified there just a kind of rapacious pursuit of wealth with very little regard to the natural consequences of it. And so the environmental degradation, and we can point to lots of examples of this that occur throughout Utah and other places of Mormon settlement in the late 19th and early 20th century, that this occurs not necessarily because of, but in spite of Latter-day Saint theology and ecclesiastical influence. That the prudence and pragmatism that church leaders had preached in those early years were basically ignored as the church adopted a more free market ideology. And so you get, by the early 20th century, essentially once that pioneer generation is dead or dying out, you get a kind of different calculation in terms of the relationship of the Latter-day Saints to the land. So in 1902, Brigham Young Jr., who was the son of Brigham Young and at the time was president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, he said this: "As long as the spirit of union existed among the people, the waters would increase and the land would become more fertile. On the other hand, as the spirit of litigation increased, the waters decreased and the land deteriorated." He testified that it was by union that the waters increased and not by court decrees. And he warned that the farms would dry up and become dust only to be blown away if we became divided and contentious. So you can hear here Apostle Young saying that the land would produce, the rain would come, the farmers would have enough water, the land would flourish, not based on how the Latter-day Saints actually treated the land, but he connected it to their own morality, to their personal morality and to their communal morality, their ability to be united as saints, which of course is a common refrain among church leaders. So by the early 20th century, there's not a lot of talk about how do we take care of the land for its own sake. It's simply a notion that if we are righteous, if we obey God's commandments, if we are unified as a people, God will simply bless the land. He'll send the rain, and the land will flourish for our sake. All right. So that's a little snapshot of the pioneer generation. And all of this, there's lots more that we could say, but I'm just necessarily giving little snapshots. So let's fast forward just a little bit to John A. Whitsoe, an apostle of the church in kind of the next generation in the early 20th century. Now, Whitsoe, of course, is a very impressive figure. He'd been educated at Harvard. He'd received his PhD at Göttingen in Germany, one of the most prestigious universities there. He was an influential agronomist. At one point, he was president of Utah State Agricultural College, which is now Utah State University, where I teach. So he was a very, very impressive figure in his field, a person of national and even international renown when it came to being a scientist and an agronomist. And he had a love affair for the land. He said, and this is a statement that almost could have come out of the mouth of Thomas Jefferson or something like that. But Whitsoe said, "We Latter-day Saints are a land-loving people. We believe in the land. We are a land-using people. We Latter-day Saints must ever remember the sanctity and the holiness of the land given us by the Father. There is safety in the land." All right, so we're a land-loving people. We're a land-using people, but also recognizing that the land has inherent sanctity and holiness as given by God. Now, there's the kind of little snapshot, the vignette that I want to portray here comes in 1925. Now, Whitsoe, again, was a person of considerable influence and was sought out not just by other academics, but by government leaders for advice on irrigation, on agricultural techniques, and so forth. And so he was requested to write a report for the premier, or essentially the governor of Alberta. And so this report that Whitsoe wrote, that this was a scientific report in terms of he was recommending and making recommendations on how Alberta could flourish and how they could continue to settle this province in the middle of Canada that received, significantly less rainfall than either of the coasts. And it's interesting, this report that he writes, it's very scientific, but it also has a kind of pastoral dimension. So there are a lot of elements in this report that he writes to the premier of Alberta that is talking about the land, not just in terms of its economic function, but also in the way that it would facilitate the kind of social and spiritual life of the people who lived there. Now, Whitsoe encouraged significant investment in irrigation. So rather than using dry farming techniques, he said the government needs to invest heavily in irrigation projects to produce steady crops, and he also thought steady people. And what he imagined is, he said, we need areas of dense settlement. So rather than farmers just very scattered as they needed to be with dry farming techniques, he said, we need to create more intensive agricultural activity based on irrigation. And for him, this was not just about the productivity of the land, but he said that this kind of intensive irrigation-based agriculture would allow for the creation of communities. It would allow for farmers to establish a home set in an environment of trees, shrubs, flowers, and kitchen gardens. It will help make Canada one country under continuous human conquest from ocean to ocean. There's a bit of kind of manifest destiny going on here. And the idea here is that these communities would be settled by young or middle-aged men with families who would demonstrate their willingness to sacrifice for some years to win a financial independence on the land. So in other words, without saying as much, what Whitsoe is suggesting in 1925 to the premier of Alberta is, you need to do what the Latter-day Saints did in Utah. You need to use these kinds of techniques to create intensive communities, intensive and intentional communities that would attract families, that would create communities, and where the land would itself be the means or the mechanism to facilitate the moral development of human families and human communities. So the goal of agriculture was not, in the end, economic, nor was Whitsoe primarily concerned with the land itself, except as it supported social life and a kind of domestic ideal. So here we have Whitsoe in the early 20th century, again, thinking about the land as instrumental for the creation of a certain kind of human community. All right, so let's fast forward to the next generation, and let's talk about Ezra Taft Benson. Now, I think most people here will be familiar with Ezra Taft Benson, longtime apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, eventually president of the church from 1985 to 1994, but also famously served all 8 years as Secretary of Agriculture in Dwight D. Eisenhower's cabinet from 1953 to 1961. And at the time, we don't think about this. We don't think about it this way because the country has changed and the federal government has changed. But at the time, in the 1950s, the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it was the second largest government entity behind the Department of Defense in terms of spending, in terms of staffing. So this was a very prestigious position. And it was a position with real clout in terms of making policy that made a real difference for millions of Americans. Now, under Benson's leadership as Secretary of Agriculture, the USDA invested heavily in education programs to help individual farmers learn more about soil and water conservation. So conservation was at the heart of Benson's plan and strategy for what he imagined as the future of farming. We can talk a lot about his policies. It's really under Benson that we move much more towards agribusiness. We see the development of chemicals and other kinds of things, especially after World War II, with modern technologies that revolutionized the nature of farming. So I won't necessarily get into all that here, but I want to focus here on what he said about conservation. So he went around the country giving talks about this, talking about the importance of conservation, trying to educate farmers about conservation. And for him, as he did so, he always had in mind his own experience as a farmer on a family farm in Whitney, Idaho, just up the road from me. In fact, he seemed haunted by what he called the enormous menace of erosion. He said during the kind of his stump speech that he gave in many places as he traveled around, he said, "Still fresh in my memory are the disastrous floods that time and again wrought havoc with the canal systems and buried whole farms under sterile debris." And so he said, we need to look ahead as far as we can. We need to be prudent. We need to be wise about the way that we use the land, to preserve it for future generations. And he said, yes, the federal government has a role to play, but he said, ultimately, the viability, the long-term success of these programs, the long-term success of agriculture in this country would depend on, in his words, local responsibility and leadership, from the millions of good decisions on individual farms and in thousands of local communities that add up to progress. So he was very much, again, there's a bit of irony here. I mean, he's the head of the USDA, which is, again, the second biggest department in the federal government, and it expanded during his time significantly. Still, nevertheless, his ideology and his strategy is always about local control, that it would be individual farmers, local communities, though they would be the ones making the decisions and doing the work of conservation, and that the federal government would at best play a support role. And it's interesting, Benson said, as he went around talking to people, he said, the end purpose of conservation is not just the welfare of the land, but the welfare of the people. Now, I hear very much a kind of Mormon strain of thinking from these early Joseph Smith revelations, that the land is given to human beings, that it's given for the benefit of human beings. So he has this ideology that fits squarely within kind of 20th century conservatism, that his environmental ethic, and he did have a sincere environmental ethic, but it was based on personal responsibility, local control, common sense, and the priority of human needs considered both in the present and for the future. Now, of course, Benson leaves the cabinet in 1961, but he doesn't leave public life, and he doesn't stop thinking about these issues. In the 1970s, as the environmental movement actually picked up steam, as you all know, Benson watched this very closely, and he was actually very critical of it. A lot of this comes from his own personal politics. He'd actually moved further and further to the right, and so anything that he saw associated with the political left, he was critical of. But he was still, even years after leaving the Department of Agriculture, he was still seen as an expert and an influential voice in these matters. And so in 1975, he was invited to the White House as part of a forum to talk about domestic policy, including agricultural policy. And he gives this speech, and it's basically a Jeremiad. I mean, it's this kind of withering address in which he's talking about ecology. He's talking about the environment, but in a very different way than what we're starting to hear in the 1970s from that generation of environmentalists. And this is what he said in the White House at this White House gathering in 1975. He said, those who undertake the task of alerting their fellow men with regard to physical ecology without also paying heed to spiritual laws have undertaken an impossible task. And this is where he quoted one of Joseph Smith's revelations. For the earth is full, and there is enough and to spare. Yea, I, God, prepared all things and have given unto the children of men to be agents unto themselves. And he goes on to quote Brigham Young, who said, everything we have has been bestowed upon us for our action to see what we would do with it. So in other words, Benson is saying, and of course, this is the time when people are talking about demographic explosions, a population time bomb, that the Earth could not sustain the human population, especially as it was advancing at current rates in the 1970s. And Benson was having none of this. He said, God said the Earth is full and there's enough and to spare, and he means that. And there's enough for every human being who will be born on this planet. And Benson went on. He expressed concern. He loved the landscape. He loved the land. He expressed concern over what he called scarred landscapes that cause floods and leave an economic emptiness that haunts the coming generations. So he was not calloused towards the land, but it's really interesting. He said, just as, and this is still at the White House, he's saying this, just as disastrous as are all these floods, is what he called the onslaught of unchastity, which leaves terrible scars, brings floods of tears and anguish, and leaves moral emptiness. And so for Benson, the root problem of environmental degradation and moral degradation were one and the same. He said, both imprudent strip mining and unchastity rest on a lifestyle that partakes of an eat, drink, and be merry philosophy, gouge and grab now without regard to the consequences. Both negligent strip mining and unchastity violate the spirit of stewardship over our planet and person. I don't think I've ever heard any other church leader talking about strip mining and chastity hand in hand, but he saw both of them as serious moral issues, but with this common root of human essentially rapaciousness, as he says, kind of gouge and grab now without regard to the consequences. And so if he saw the same moral problem at the root of both environmental and moral degradation, he said the solution was basically the same. He said the church should urge its members to be efficient users of our resources, to avoid waste and pollution, and to clean up their own immediate environment or that over which they have control. Notice here, he's not talking about a church program, nor is he talking about a government program. He's talking about individual people being efficient users of their own resources to clean things up in their own immediate environment. For Benson, it was always about local and individual personal action. And he said it was incumbent on every person to get back to the precepts of Sinai and the teachings of Christ our Lord. So physical salvation for the earth, moral salvation, spiritual salvation for its inhabitants were essentially one and the same thing. It had to do with the cumulative moral action of responsible individual human agents. It wasn't about government planning. It wasn't about social activism. It was about individual people pursuing moral action, and then all of that adding up. Okay, so now I want to fast forward again to more contemporary period, kind of late 20th or early 21st century. Now, Whitsoe and Benson, of course, were part of the generations of late 19th and early 20th century Latter-day Saints in the American and Canadian West, who basically encountered the land primarily through work, through toil, through subsistence. They were farmers, they were ranchers, they came from the land. And so their relationship to the land was actually rather different in terms of their own personal experience than would be the case for most late 20th century environmentalists, who were typically prosperous urbanites or suburbanites who thought of nature primarily in aesthetic or even spiritual frameworks, who saw nature as something separate from human society, something to be retreated to for recreation, recuperation, restoration, not necessarily something that you live in and work with, the same way that was true for some of these earlier generations, people like Whitsoe and Benson. And so I think we see here in a lot of the discussions and debates over the environment over the past half century have been in large part because of a shifting human relationship to the land. And so the rhetoric around it has changed very much, especially in the West, where you have both this ideal of a kind of pristine wilderness that coexists with the reality of the fact that the West is the nation's most urbanized region. In 2010, about 90% of Westerners lived in urban areas, which was the highest percentage in the nation. So we don't oftentimes think about it that way, but the West both is the place of this incredible wilderness areas, these vast expanses of wilderness, and at the same time, it's the nation's most urbanized area. And so that's created a very particular dynamic, and then add to that all the kind of political ideologies of the West that have led to conflicts between local landowners, ranchers, and others with the federal government. So Latter-day Saints are, they're just part of these historical trends and part of these historical processes in the late 20th century. And late 20th century saints who are increasingly not rural, but increasingly urban and especially suburban, they're still trying to find ways to remain connected to the land. There's still this ideal, like Whitsoe said, that we're a land-loving and a land-using people. And so obviously Boy Scouts plays into this significantly. The youth program, I think more for boys than for girls, but increasingly for girls. The idea of youth camps that would take people out into nature and out into the wilderness. And nature, I think for late 20th century Latter-day Saints and 21st century Latter-day Saints, nature becomes the place where boys and girls go to have experience, to be tested, to build character, to engage in self-discovery. It's a kind of removal from ordinary life where you can go kind of discover something about yourself and connect with God in a different way. So nature is important, and we love nature, and we send our kids into nature, but for very instrumental purposes. And it's for the refinement of the moral refinement of these young people in particular. So in a lot of ways, nature in the modern church plays the same role that the earth plays in Latter-day Saint theology. It's a place where humans are sent for a kind of a temporary time of probation, where their moral character is revealed and refined before they kind of move on with the rest of their existence. Now, so I think that you're just going to have a different experience and different relationship to land, to creation, to the environment as a suburbanite or an urbanite than you might as a farmer or as a rancher. And a lot of this thinking, a lot of the church's experience culminates, and this is something you all know well, I'm sure, in a statement that the church made in 2013 called Environmental Stewardship and Conservation. To date, it's kind of the most official thing the church has said and posted on its website. There have been a few other things like Bishop Cossay's General Conference talk recently, but this was a kind of a watershed a moment in 2013 when the church posted this statement. And it's a lovely statement in many respects, but it also reveals Mormon theology's anthropocentrism. That from the very first sentence, God created the earth to provide a place for the human family to learn, progress, and improve. So the entire purpose of creation, the entire purpose of the natural landscape, of the animals and the plants and the land all around us, are for human development, are for the moral and spiritual, the social, communal development of human beings on their path through the plan of salvation to become gods. Now that the statement does have, I think it has the seeds of a kind of structural critique of private property, a critique of a culture of mass consumption, certainly a critique of ecologically rapacious practices. But in a lot of ways, those things are only hinted at. They culminate in a rather blunt statement: making the earth ugly offends God. That's fairly blunt. Now it doesn't really define what that means. It doesn't go on to list a lot of individual practices. It certainly doesn't call out anybody in particular. But this is a principle-based statement. Making the earth ugly offends God. And what the statement offers is, or endorses, is a balanced approach, including both consumption and conservation, with the needs of the earth and of current and future generations having a claim over the immediate vindication of personal desires or avowed rights. This sounds a lot like President Benson in 1975. It's this kind of short-term, who's denouncing a kind of short-term profit-driven thinking that gives no heed to future generations or to the impact on the land. And the concluding paragraph of this 2013 statement says that the state of the human soul and the environment are interconnected, with each affecting and influencing the other. So again, with Mormonism, with the church, it will always come back to the human person. It's never the land for the land's sake. It's never the environment for the environment's sake. It's always the interconnectedness of the environment and the human person. Now, and I think it's significant that in this statement that I think has a lot to build off of and has a lot of really positive things, but it's still an apolitical statement that on one of the defining issues of our time, the church's the fullest and most definitive statement essentially remains neutral. This is a stark contrast to the way that the church weighed in politically in issues around same-sex marriage and religious freedom recently. And so clearly for the church, despite some good and strong statements, despite some good movement in these directions, it seems clear that while the church is not silent on the question of environmental care, it's relegated it to personal conscience and individual stewardship. That basically it said that this is a matter of personal responsibility, individual moral action, local control. It's not something the church seems to be weighing in on in terms of politics or policy in any kind of substantial way. Okay, so with all of that, with that kind of theological foundation, with those 4 snapshots, let me just wrap up with a few culminating thoughts and takeaways. So as I review all of this history, and necessarily this was brief, and there's a lot more that could be said. There's ways that we could complicate this narrative, but as I look at all of this, for me, there are 2 basic takeaways. The first basic takeaway is that Mormon theology is simply anthropocentric. I think it just simply is. Human beings, I would argue, are the beginning and end of Mormon theology. And any theological reflection about creation, about the environment, begins and ends with its relationship to humanity. I don't see any way around that. I think it's pretty consistent and pretty clear in restoration scripture and prophetic teaching, let alone action. Okay, so Mormon theology is anthropocentric. The second takeaway is simply that the church does not have a particularly strong track record when it comes to creation care that goes much beyond fairly unspecific moral admonitions to care for and not extort God's creation. The church has not been vocal on issues around climate change, and it simply has not mobilized politically around environmental issues the same way it has around other issues that it deems to be moral issues. So it has not, for whatever reason, the church has not thrown creation care in with some of these other moral issues that it's decided to mobilize politically around. Okay, so I would say those are kind of 2 descriptive facts that, I mean, maybe people could argue with me, but as I review the facts, that's what I see. Okay, so with these twin facts, both the anthropocentrism of Mormon theology and the church's basic apoliticism around environmental issues, where do we go from here? Where does that leave us? I think on the one hand, it would be easy to take a glass half empty approach. It would be easy to be rather discouraged about this. Again, those critics that I cited earlier, it would be easy to take those positions. Okay, that the Latter-day Saint creation is in some way inimical to environmental thought, to environmental action. But I don't think that's right. I don't think we have to take a glass half empty approach to these realities and to this history. So what would a glass half full approach look like? Well, I think it's it would look a lot like what MESA is doing and what the members of MESA believe and are doing in the world. I think it looks like saying that, yes, Mormon theology is a theology that emphasizes the human person and emphasizes the choice and accountability and responsibility inherent in the human person. That Mormon theology emphasizes human responsibility. Clearly, in every book of Latter-day Saint scripture, it becomes clear that the environment is part of human beings' divinely granted stewardship. There's no question about that. Nowhere in the Revelations does our millennial vision of a renewed earth abrogate or supersede God's original commandment to humans to be stewards over creation. At no point are any of those commandments, and the notion of stewardship is repeated again in every book of scripture repeatedly. And even while it's paired with a kind of millennial vision where the earth will be renewed at some future point, at no point does that millennial vision say, well, actually, the mission of stewardship can be set aside. So clearly, in restoration theology and restoration scripture, while it's human-centered, that human-centeredness includes an accountability and responsibility, and we're invited to be agents on behalf of our stewardships. That's very clear and it's very central, I think, to Mormon theology. Second, I think precisely because the institutional church has by and large left a void in this area, it leaves ample space for individuals and groups like MESA to step in and be anxiously engaged. The church will not lead out on all things, on every question of moral or ethical importance that human beings face around the world. It never has, it never will. It does not provide all of the answers or the guidance on all matters of importance. And so precisely because of the church's relative silence, again, not complete silence, not by any stretch, but relative silence on one of the most pressing issues of our times, I think we can hear this as an invitation to action. It's precisely the hole in the middle of the donut, so to speak, that we get invited to fill. And I think of this in relationship to Jesus's teaching to his disciples near the end of his life, when he said that the poor will be with you always, that this was a challenge, not an excuse. Similarly, to say that the earth is full, that there's enough and to spare, it's a challenge to just action. It's not an excuse for poor stewardship. So I think it's precisely because of the anthropocentric nature of Mormon theology, and it's precisely because the church has clearly left this up to to this point. It could change in the future, but to this point, the church has left this to individual moral actors. It's precisely what necessitates and calls for each of us to step in to those two things, to step in to our own personal accountability and responsibility for the stewardship that God has given to human beings in relationship to the rest of creation. And it's clearly for each of us to determine that this is a pressing moral issue, on par with, if not exceeding, many of the other issues that we've identified as moral issues in recent years and recent decades, to say that it does demand our full attention, our best efforts on an individual and personal and group and communal basis. And the fact that the church itself has not directly lobbied, in these kinds of areas means nothing about and says nothing about the ability of individual members and groups to do so. So I actually think at the end of the day, this history is something that we can learn from. I think the theology can empower us rather than paralyze us, and I think the church has left plenty of space for ourselves as individuals and groups like MESA to do the work that we need to care for the creation that God has given us stewardship in relation to. And I hope we'll all do this. I need to do better myself. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing on behalf of this gift of creation that God has given us. And I say all this in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was awesome. Before we open it up for a Q&A, which we'd love for you to put your comments or questions in the chat, we're going to do a land acknowledgement with our board secretary, Mark Bowles-Ritchie.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks so much for that great presentation. And I just wanted to mention that Indigenous peoples were on this land before the settlers arrived, and they lived off this land. The Paiute, the Shoshone, the Ute, Goshute, and other Indigenous communities stewarded this land, and they deserve our respect and admiration and recognition that they are still on these lands today. And if we think about how hard it would have been to live off the land without any of the materials that came from the East Coast that the settlers brought, it's pretty impressive that they lived off the plants and animals and the soil of this land. So I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, if anyone has questions, we'd love for you to drop them in the chat, or we can open the option up for unmuting if you're on your phone. I'm not the host, so I'll have someone else do that. But yeah, if anyone has questions, please feel free to ask them now.
Patrick, I'll just mention one other thing while we're waiting for others. You know, the temple ceremony is, to me, it's a conservation statement. What do you think?
I think clearly, yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously I didn't talk about that here, but I think that's another great resource to draw upon theologically. That should be inspiring and should be foundational for Latter-day Saints to think about their relationship. I mean, the amount of time that's dedicated in that ceremony to think about creation, that should lead temple going Latter-day Saints to really reflect on their relationship to the rest of God's creation.
Go ahead, Arthur.
I just have a question about what you perceive the role of the institutionalized church to be in the near future. They came out with that statement about the Great Salt Lake.
Yeah.
You think that they'll have a role? And the reason I'm asking the question is because I'm wondering about ways to influence the many people who are not well informed or don't care very much about environmental stewardship and might have good intentions but are focused on development or something like that. And they need kind of a push, probably from a more powerful and larger group than MESA probably could ever hope to be. So I'm just wondering, does the institutionalized church have a role, do you think, moving forward in the environmental movement?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think we should absolutely point to and celebrate what the church just did in relation to the Great Salt Lake and in terms of releasing so much water to help save and preserve the lake. I think that's a truly admirable act, and they said there'd be more to come. They said that was only a first step. So I'm really pleased to see that. Also, some of the church's recent developments in terms of the way that they're talking about greener architecture, the way that they're ripping up some lawns and trying to be responsible water users in particular, especially in the inner Mountain West. Now, in some ways, that's very localized. I mean, it's a global church, and the environmental issues are going to be so different in different places. We know that a lot of places where there are many church members are going to be places that are going to be most affected in the near term by the climate crisis, like many of the islands in the South Pacific and other things. So I actually do expect that the church has recently created an office. I forget exactly what they call it, but it has to do with environmental issues. So they're paying attention to it, and we could say, it's a little late, but better late than never. And I always believe in a kind of both and approach. that yes, we want the church to be responsible. We want the church to take a lead on important issues like this. But I also don't think we can wait for everything. I mean, I believe strongly in that notion of being, anxiously engaged, to be agents, to be proactively engaged in good causes of ourselves. So we can't necessarily wait for the church to do everything for us. And it's precisely as we wait for the church to, and again, I fully expect more positive and more both quantitative and qualitative action on behalf from the church on these issues. Not just in Utah, but around the globe. But in the meantime, I think there's plenty of space for individual Latter-day Saints to act.
Go ahead, Bryant.
You mentioned Bishop Caussé and the comments he made. I'm sure I tried to read as much into it as I could when I listened. But I thought it was so encouraging. And I don't think he was the only one that brought up things that opened the door even a little bit toward responsibility we all have. So did you feel that was very favorable? I mean, you mentioned it.
Yeah. No, I think so. I thought it was a great statement. I hope that it'll be built on, and I actually think it's significant that it came from him, from the presiding bishop. I think many members of the church maybe don't fully appreciate the significance of the presiding bishopric. That group is as to the temporal affairs of the church. They are in some ways more important than the Quorum of the 12. Now they report to the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12, but they are the ones actually managing and making policy for the church in all of its temporal affairs. And so they're going to be the ones making decisions about architecture, about land use, about all those kinds of things. So the fact that it was Bishop Caussé saying that, I think, is actually quite significant and quite encouraging. So that's another reason for me. I'm kind of glass half full on this, is because I'm seeing good movement. Again, we could say we want it to be faster, we want it to be more, but I'll take positive movement wherever we can find it.
Thanks.
So one of the questions we had in the chat is, how do you suggest individuals move forward in advocating for church member environmental stewardship when we have such a history of uncaring?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, one of the great things, one of the main takeaways I have as a historian and studying people's actions in the past is in realizing that human decisions really matter. Now, structures really matter, and policy and politics and all those things really matter. But the fact is that humans make decisions, and whatever humans have done can be undone, and whatever humans have left undone can be done. So we're not, and this is fundamental to Latter-day Saint theology, that we're not trapped by our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents' decisions. Now, we're conditioned by them. We operate within constraints of what other people have created for us, but we are free to choose. And so yeah, the fact that our people have not been great on this issue over our 200-year history I think doesn't need to impinge at all. And if anything, we can use it as a kind of clarion call, as a call to repentance. We believe in a gospel of faith unto repentance, and so we can repent and we can do better and not be ashamed of what's happened in the past, but simply say we resolve to do better. Now, what it does mean is that we don't have a kind of clear history to draw on. It's a complicated history, and in some ways it's counterproductive history. But we have plenty of theological resources. We have people that we can point to. We have statements that we can point to from the past. But for the most part, Latter-day Saints are a forward-looking people. So as much as we love and appreciate our history, we're not trapped by it. And we can move forward and we can make both individual and collective decisions to do better starting today.
Awesome. Another question we had in the chat is, some talks by Joseph F. Smith and Spencer Kimball come to mind about land conservation and the wickedness of unnecessarily killing of animals. Why do you think some of these general statements have not been as highlighted as other of their teachings?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, and we could point to their statements. We could point to several others. I think a couple of things. One is that those statements have been just kind of episodic. Those statements have not been consistent and widespread and given by lots and lots of church leaders. And so it's actually easy to dismiss or what seem like individual and somewhat random statements by church leaders. So that's one thing. So we need for if this is going to kind of take root and what we'd hope to see and the issues that people care about and register on are the things where church leaders consistently, clearly, persuasively, and widely talk about an issue, not just in kind of episodic and scattershot fashion. The other thing too is that Latter-day Saints, just like all other human beings, especially now in the 21st century, we're guilty of reading our theology through our politics and through our experience. So this is not to say that American conservatism is necessarily hostile towards the environment. But I think it's fair to say that, especially over the past century, that business interests, development interests have predominated among the American right. And as Latter-day Saints have found themselves more and more aligned with the political right, they also have been aligned with those business and development interests and have, especially in the culture wars since the 1960s and 1970s, have oftentimes identified environmentalism as part of the political left, which is seen with suspicion. And so I think it's only natural that the Latter-day Saints have sometimes ignored or downplayed certain aspects of our own theology because of the political filters that we put on that.
From the chat. Let me read
What was
one.
that? Sorry, I missed part of that, Mark.
Okay. Unlike most of our Christian siblings who believe heaven is elsewhere, Latter-day Saints believe the earth will be the celestial kingdom. How do you see this belief as being one that could motivate members about creation care? Yeah,
it's a terrific question. I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it could clearly be a resource to say, hey, this is earth is ours. We're going to live here forever, folks, right? I mean, this is not a disposable resource. On the other hand, and this is where I was talking a little bit about millennialism, sometimes Latter-day Saints can say something like, yes, I recognize that the earth will be the celestial kingdom, we'll live here, but it's going to be transformed by Jesus Christ. And so it's not about what I do, that the world's going to get worse and worse and worse before the second coming. Not much we can do about that. It's been prophesied. And so therefore it's not human action, but it's divine action, which is going to render this place habitable for the eternities and celestial. Now I think there's some good ways to kind of persuasively kind of wrestle with that position. I think Latter-day Saint theology is always predicated on human action. We don't just sit passively for Jesus to come. We're actually called to prepare the earth for his coming. That should mean taking care of the earth prior to his coming. But again, yeah, like almost any other aspect of theology, it rarely is kind of crystal clear in terms of how it, people can interpret it differently. And I think that's the case here. But it certainly can be a resource for environmental action and saying, no, we have a calling to this place. This is not disposable.
Abigail, Bob has his hand up.
I can't unmute.
Go ahead, Bob.
First of all, thanks very much, Patrick. A terrific presentation. In response to a couple of things that were said, it seems to me that one of the things we can do is change our article of faith from the earth will be renewed to we will renew the earth so it can receive its paradisiacal glory. I think it's also helpful if we look at the future, not only in terms of the plants and the animals, but the billions, or the millions of people who will be adversely affected by what we do in terms of what Christ calls us to. It seems to me we have no higher calling than those others who basically are, many of them at least, are powerless because they don't have the resources we do. When I was on the island of Kiribati a number of years ago, working with the Bountiful Children's Foundation, I understood that that's the first nation that will lose all of its landmass to rising seas. You think also about, I saw a friend of mine today said, all the things going to happen. The studies show that one of the places that's really going to be affected least is North America. And I said, yes, but can you imagine what the effect of the global south is going to be as all of those migrants start pushing toward where we are, so that in a sense, it's almost as if we are not thinking about those people in relation to ourselves. And it seems to me that as Latter-day Saints, as Christians, are called to be stewards of the earth is to be called to be stewards of the earth's inhabitants, including all of those generations who, are so, right now are so dramatically affected, but will continue to be. And one final thing, when I spoke to a group of interfaith people, Gloria and I, on Wednesday night, and the question was about, one of the questions was about the, whatever it is, $50 to $150 billion. The suggestion was made that the most important missionary thing the church could do would be to start an $8 billion fund to address climate issues and invite participation and suggestion from all of the people of faith in the nations of the world. It would seem to me we are now in this place of defending or excusing or trying to explain or accept that colossal amount of wealth. And it would be, again, I just think that to be able to do something with it that is so dramatically important in terms of where we are would be a wonderful thing for the church.
Yeah, fantastic. Good to see you, Bob. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think I fully believe that, the restoration is now about 200 years old, which is a blip in terms of world history, and also makes us still an infant compared to other world religions. But 200 years is not nothing. And in that 200 years, the Lord has blessed us with tremendous capacity and tremendous gifts, including now the financial gifts that the church has. And it seems to me that as we move into the third century of the restoration, the question that we have to start asking ourselves is, what are we going to do with the incredible bounty that God has given us? Not just financial bounty, but spiritual bounty and other things. The Latter-day Saints are an incredibly capable people. And I think in the third century of the restoration, I hope we turn those gifts to the service of the world. And that includes the financial gifts that we have. And I also completely agree, Bob, with your second point. I think if and when the Latter-day Saints take, both institutionally and communally, take a more decisive turn towards environmental care, I think we've got to make the case about the impact on human beings. Again, that's just the way we're wired. In some ways, that's the way that the theology is set up, as I was suggesting. And so as much as we can talk about creation care and the plants and animals and the landscapes around us, I actually think what may be more strategically effective is precisely what you talked about, is talking about the human impact of all of this, especially in these places where the church is present. And again, just strategically, that's going to pull on the hearts and on the minds of Latter-day Saints more than maybe some of the other arguments, persuasive and important arguments are made. But I think the human impact towards other members of the church in these places where many members of the church have served missions and have been on, humanitarian missions and so forth, that may be strategically the most persuasive thing to affect people's hearts and minds.
Go ahead, David. You can unmute now.
You unmute there. In regard to the last couple of comments, I think I'd like to comment on this, and that is one of the most impactful statements I think a general officer of the church has made would be from Sharon Eubank. And many of you may know her as probably the best traveled general officer of the church who knows the nitty gritty of the poor and the vulnerable and what they need. And a few years ago, she said, isn't there something more important to do? Shouldn't we be caring for she's saying that some people would ask her, isn't there something more important to do? Shouldn't we be caring for the poor versus caring for the earth? And my question is, are they not linked so inextricably that we can't do one without caring for the other? Mm-hmm. I think that summarizes what the last few comments are about. Caring for the poor and vulnerable is what the gospel is about. What are your thoughts on that?
Completely agree. And Saint Sharon for the win yet again. I'm such a fan of Sharon Eubank, and you're exactly right. Because of her travels, her experience, the conversations she's had, almost unparalleled among other leaders of the church, maybe completely unparalleled. She has a front row view, and her conversations with other humanitarian organizations and others, she's been deeply educated on these things, and I think she has a lot of wisdom. I'm very glad that she continues to have the role that she does, and I hope that she continues to exert influence. But yeah, I had not heard that statement from her, and I think, as usual, she nails it on the head.
Patrick, I wonder if you could provide us with the references, the list of the references that you read in this meeting, and if you give it to Soren or Abigail or myself, we can pass it on to everybody who was at this meeting.
Yeah, they all come from a published article that I have in a chapter from a year or two ago. So I'll send the article to Abigail, and then she can circulate it to anybody else who's interested.
What's the title of the article in the book?
Well, the book is it's a collection of essays on, I forget what it's called. I think it's called Beyond the Culture Wars. It's about religion and American politics, basically. And so the title of my essay is The Fullness of the Earth is Yours, Environmental Politics in the Mormon Culture Region.
One other question we had in the chat, where is it? Laurel asked, my concern is about the vast overdevelopment of the population centers along the Wasatch Front. Every single space that becomes available seems to be gobbled up by developers, and either high-priced homes are built or strip malls and other. In my estimation, if the use of our land grew up on a small farm in the middle of the Salt Lake Valley, and growing our own food was always a big part of our life in this valley, nowadays food quality and scarcity is becoming a serious concern of many people I talk with. Any thoughts, Patrick?
Yeah, well, I'm sure lots of you have a lot more wisdom on this than I do. I mean, I'll just say, like, I had a friend come and he's not from Utah and hasn't spent all that much time here, but he was here visiting, and we were driving up and down I-15, and he said he was sort of increasingly despondent, and he said, like, such a beautiful place and such an ugly place at the same time. Like, what have you done to this place, right? And it was interesting to see it through his eyes. that this is so tough, right? Balancing human needs versus the needs of the land and the environment, the water, especially in this region. I'm not sure that I'm in any position to tell people that they can't have X number of children, or that a certain number of people can't move here. I'm not sure that population controls of various kinds are the answer, but I do think that the planning, and this is just my personal opinion, I think we've been really poor planners along the Wasatch Front. We've just in terms of land use, in terms of the type of development that we've done, lawns and all these kinds of, our water use has been really unwise and been poor. I'm pointing the finger at myself. I live in a lovely suburban home with a lawn, and we're thinking about ways to change that. But this is just the culture and the nature of development here in Utah. So again, we can't undo the past, but maybe. And there are very powerful forces that frankly care a lot more about profit than care about responsible use of the resources, especially with the growing population, with the #1 economy in the country. People are going to keep coming here. There's going to be increasing demands and pressures on the natural resources here and on the land along the Wasatch Front. So I think this is a really pivotal time for Utahns and for Westerners in general. The West is the fastest growing region in the country, and so this is precisely where citizen groups like MESA matter. And I think Mormon Women for Ethical Government have they're stepping up into some of these issues. So again, the church will do some good things along the way, but it's going to be up to individuals to try and become informed and to make their voices heard to create the kinds of communities that we want to live in. But let's not pretend that the forces arrayed against us are not significant and powerful and attractive in many ways.
Thank you. And then another question, just what do you think about the connection within the Word of Wisdom and D&C 89 within Earth stewardship and creation care? Yeah,
I feel guiltier and guiltier with every question that is asked, just in terms of my own lifestyle. I've thought many times precisely about this connection and about this question, and have never been able to do it. But absolutely, the nature of our diets, our consumption patterns, they're just simply unsustainable. Mine are unsustainable. And so I have to take a good hard look at myself and say, just how committed am I? Or is this just all empty words? But there's no doubt that what we eat and what we consume are the primary drivers of what we've done to creation.
Trying to find it here, the exact question, but someone asked if you have studied in your studies noticed anything that Ezra Taft Benson's time as Secretary of Agriculture, if that influenced like LDS culture or like the saints at that time at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think he in terms of his policies about the land, the environment, around agriculture, I think Benson was a product of his times. He's certainly a shaper of things in that role, but also just the country was moving in these directions of agribusiness, of mass consumption. These were all trends that were much larger than Benson. And so I don't see any evidence that Benson substantially shaped Latter-day Saint thought or practice on these kinds of issues any more than because I think he was basically just flowing with the stream. Now he was on the conservative side of the stream, but there is no significant environmentalist movement in the 1950s when he's talking, and so the debates are different than they will become in the 1970s. If anything, people are critical of him because they see him as abandoning small farms and family farms in favor of agribusiness. But I'm not sure, especially given the experience in the Intermountain West, small farms and family farms were no friendlier to the environment than agribusiness has been. And so it's, yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but I think basically Latter-day Saints, and Benson included, were just kind of going along with the broader flow of American culture in that period.
Awesome. We have two more in the chat right now. Do you see any concerns with the expansion of freeways and corridors and displacement of homes, particularly in West Jordan?
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, this is where these are just really tough issues in terms of how to support a growing population. I mean, we've been talking here mostly about environmental justice, but we have economic justice and social justice issues to consider on all of this. So, and all of the studies show if you widen freeways, it's only going to alleviate, it's only going to create more demand for more traffic down the road. So it's only a very short-term solution to traffic issues. So, boy, I mean, it's I don't want to say that our policymakers are in an impossible position, because that would suggest that there's no solutions to be found. But they're, to weigh all of the competing interests is just enormously difficult. And at a certain point, policymakers influenced by citizens just have to decide what they're going to prioritize. Something's going to come at the cost of something else. Not everything and everyone can win. And so right now, Utah is full pedal to the metal economic growth. That is driving every policy decision here, with the possible exception of recognizing that there are certain existential things like the Great Salt Lake that, whoa, wait a minute, maybe we need to tap the brakes a little bit there. But that's what it has to become in order for it to get anybody's attention, is it has to be existential. Otherwise, economic development right now is just winning every fight and every argument. I don't think that means to give up the fight. I don't, but just to recognize that right now the deck is stacked.
Go ahead, Soren.
Patrick, good evening. Soren Simonson here. I'm one of the board members with the Mormon Environmental Stewardship Alliance. I'd love to get your thoughts. I have given a couple of talks recently in church, and I've referenced Doctrine and Covenants section 88, which is called the olive branch, in the introductory text. And there's often reference to a few verses. This was the revelation that established the school of the prophets, among other things. And I believe the first revelation that talked about kind of the foundations for temples, but there's a cluster of verses in the middle of this section that are just, to me, so insightful. I'm going to read just a couple of them. In verse 77, I give unto you a commandment that ye teach one another the doctrine of the kingdom. This one's referenced a lot, but it ends there, usually when it's referenced. But the next two verses I think are really profound. Teach ye diligently, and my grace shall attend you, that ye may be instructed more perfectly in theory and principle and doctrine, in the law of the gospel, and all things that pertain unto the kingdom of God, that are expedient for you to understand. And the next verse for me is just so critical, and we never talk about it. It says, of things both in heaven. So it's referencing, what do we learn about the doctrine of the kingdom? Of things both in the heaven and in the earth and under the earth. Things which have been, things which are, things which must shortly come to pass, things which are at home, things which are abroad, the wars and perplexities of the nations, and the judgments which are on the land, and the knowledge also of countries and of kingdoms, that ye may be prepared in all things. And I'd love to get your thought. I don't know if you've studied this revelation particularly, but it seems like, it's talking about the things we should be learning aren't just spiritual, but he's talking about in this revelation the natural sciences, things above, things on, things under the earth, things that have been, things which are things which come to pass. He's talking about, learning about countries and kingdoms. I mean, it's the natural sciences and the social sciences. And how often do we talk about those things in the context of the church? That to me seems like an enormous missed opportunity that I just don't know how you can read those verses and not say we shouldn't be studying about climate and about water resources and about land planning and development. And incidentally, this verse or this section was given just a few months before the revelation of the Plat of Zion, which Joseph Smith said, walkable communities, which is what the Plat of Zion is. It was the very first 15-minute city, which I know Governor Cox has come under a lot of fire recently from his own party because of the creation of this 15-minute city that they're talking about in the old prison site. And yet that's exactly what the Plat of Zion is. You can walk anywhere, whether it's for your food sources or your recreation or your government or your business is all within a 15-minute walk shed. And so there just seems to be so many missed opportunities that are really clearly and explicit in the scriptures that we just don't reference very often.
Couldn't agree with you more. I love that passage. I mean, I use that passage all the time with Latter-day Saint students to say, see, this is why you take general education courses, right? I mean, God tells you to study it all, right? Now it's impossible in this highly specialized world to specialize in all of it. So we all specialize in particular things, but it's all part of what God has for us. And it's not just section 88. He basically repeats the same thing in section 90 and then section 93. It's like, all right, I mean, he wants to drive this point home. And so I completely agree with you there, the importance to learn and study all these things. Also about the Plat of Zion, I think it's so rich with possibility. And one of my favorite things about the Plat of Zion is it's just a sketch. It's just an outline. And so what that is it's an invitation for us to fill it in. It's an invitation to us to decide what that's going to look like and to actually implement it. I mean, Joseph kind of tried to implement it a couple of times, and it gets adapted in various ways by early Latter-day Saints and pioneers. But that's still basically a bare sketch that gives us the opportunity to apply and adapt it. Clearly, what he had in mind in the 19th century can't just be lifted and plopped exactly into a 21st century context, because he's still talking about basically rural communities and so forth. But the principles of it, the ideas behind it, for us to take that, to adapt it, to say, what does that look like, and apply that into a 21st century context where we can. I think that's exactly what we're called to do. That's what the ongoing restoration is all about, is we take what we've been given, we receive and apply additional revelation in order to apply these things to our own current context. So yeah, absolutely.
One more question. In your opinion, why don't more people who feel that they are headed the wrong way, that we are headed the wrong way environmentally, be it clean air, water issues, et cetera, run for state political offices and not only run, but win?
Well, it's tough. I think part of it is just the political climate, and in many, the places where Latter-day Saints predominate in Utah, Idaho, Arizona, these are deep red states. Well, Arizona is kind of an interesting place. It's increasingly purple. But and again, this is not to say, I mean, there's plenty of actually really good Republican environmentalists and conservationists. So I don't want to turn this into a black and white, blue-red issue. But the fact is that at least in Utah and Idaho, running on a platform of environmental justice is usually not a gateway to statewide or even local office, especially in the current context. We recently had a case here in Logan where actually, it was an open seat for the state legislature. A really good candidate ran largely around environmental issues. And he just couldn't muster the votes despite running a really good campaign, I think having a persuasive message, but he had a D in front of his name instead of an R, and that's just the kiss of death, at least in this context. And so frankly, we need more Republican environmentalists. We need more Republican conservationists. If we rely on the Democratic Party to get it done, if we make this a partisan issue where only one party cares about these issues, then we've really done a disservice. And so Republicans and conservatives, they love the land, they love the environment, they use it too. And so we need to find ways to depoliticize the issue and find ways that that people can engage from both parties. That's not where we're at right now, but if we're going to make any progress on this front, these have to become bipartisan issues. It can't just become the province of the Democrats.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you have more questions for Patrick, his email is really easy to find online. But it's patrick.mason@usu.edu. And if you want to rewatch this presentation, it will be up on the MESA YouTube account in like 3 or 4 days. I need to get around to editing it. But again, thank you so much, Patrick. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.